a lot of the work that people do, the people are interested in here, involves social science using text as data. So the conversation they're going to be having today with you is within the context of the text as data paradigm, as you see in the text as data conferences, for example. And probably one of the best places, even though, I mean, there's a newer book, but I think the original paper is actually just a really great place to start, is this paper by Grimmer and Stewart, where they lay out the space of the kinds of content analysis that one does, specifically in the political science domain. And you can see a lot of the familiar favorite things there. You see topic models, you see classification, you see clustering, you see ideal point models, and so forth in here, right? Now, I do want to mention, you got to go read the paper. Here are some very important morals from their paper. The last one is the one that I want to emphasize here, which they say, validate, validate, validate. This is not really related to the topic of my talk per se, but it should be underlying everything that you are doing. As I mentioned in the conversation earlier with somebody today, I think maybe it was Dallas, I think we have two possibilities of things taking place. One is that the social sciences help improve the directions of AI, by actually taking experimental methodology and thinking carefully about constructs and all these things that social scientists are good at. And the LLM-based AI improves. The other is that, and forgive me, I'm going to say this extremely, even though I'm being recorded, the LLM view infects social science. And people don't spend a lot of time thinking about things like sampling issues and careful definitions of their constructs and all of the other good science things that people doing data science together with social science should be doing. So that's why I'm kind of including that up there. So here's the issue. To do social science, which is looking at the science of individuals and groups and organizations, what we really care about is what's going on in people's heads. When we study opinions and attitudes, when we do surveys, when we try to identify subgroups within groups, right? What we really care about is that, and what we actually work with is what they say, right? We actually analyze what they say. And this can be problematic because what they say may actually not be an adequate reflection of what's going on inside people's heads. So, for example, here's a couple at a marriage counselor. You see the sign over there, and the one person, she says, the dishwasher broke yesterday. Right? Imagine that scenario. Now imagine the scenario is slightly different. He broke the dishwasher yesterday. Any of you in relationships where you can tell the difference? No, this is not a personal example, although I am married to a clinical psychologist. You can tell, look, the words are virtually identical. Right? The only differences in words are stop words if you were doing a bag of word model, right? And yet these are two very, very different statements if we were trying to study what was going on here. So there you go. I mean, the thing up there is what we care about, right? Similarly, as more of a real world example, we have here, James Alex Fields was convicted of killing Heather Heyer when he plowed his car. This was at the neo-Nazi march, and in an earlier version of the talk, those lines would have been animated in, and I would have asked you which news source produced which of those two sentences. Pretend you don't see the lines. You still know, right? But notice the wording is very, very similar, right? Killing Heather Heyer, resulting in the death of Heather Heyer, plowed his car, the car plowed, right? So in terms of the words, the things that we typically analyze, you're not seeing as much in terms of differences as might be useful to us. Now, linguists for a really long time have spent time trying to understand what's behind the language. So here is a representation of lexical conceptual structure that goes back to work in the late 80s and early 90s. And you'll notice that, say, he broke the dishwasher, the semantic representation for that transitive construction includes the fact that the event involves causation. That's in the yellow highlighting, right? Whereas the dishwasher broke, the thing happening is the same, the stuff in blue, but there's no causation. Maybe it just happened. There's no attribution of cause. So as linguists, we think about underlying semantic representations, right? Let's take another example here. So the car killed the protesters. The man killed the protesters. Notice in both of these cases, you have causation, right? But in the first example, the first thing is assumed to be inanimate, right? Or it applies when things are inanimate. Whereas the second underlying representation, if there is an instrument involved, like how, with an axe, with a car, et cetera, then we attribute animacy or perhaps even humanness. Well, no, maybe the lion killed the antelope with its teeth or something, right? So, but you have inferences associated with the language that are part of the underlying stuff going on behind what's actually said, right? And people have taken this to, so this is from a project, the Universal Decompositional Semantics data set at Johns Hopkins. And so you can take a big representation of a sentence, and I'm just highlighting here, they take properties like, well, if the police commander of this place announced as the verb, then you have, they instigated the event. They had volitional involvement in the event. They had awareness of the event and what they were doing, and so forth. More underlying stuff, right? Okay, so I don't need to beat a dead horse here. So I'm going to go quickly past this slide, even though it's got a funny example. But, you know, can you pass the salt? Yes. Right? What's underneath here? What's underneath here is an entire theory of something called speech acts. This is one person's inventory of 69 of them, all right? Can you pass the salt comes across as a request for information, right? But it's actually a request for an action. It's not a yes/no question, right? Okay, I'm going to skip the example that comes from one of the Pink Panther movies, just in the interest of time. We can go back to people who are interested. So linguistic communication, what I'm trying to say, is all about latent or underlying representations. That's what language is about. The stuff that you're seeing is not about just the expression. It's embedded in a much larger context, which I've represented here using a noisy channel model, because I think it's a good way of expressing it. We don't really care about the details, but what we care about is that in the source, there's all sorts of underlying stuff, beliefs and values and goals. These create something called a communicative intent, is what people use in the literature. That's more than just the semantic meaning of something. It's the contextualized meaning. It's what pragmatics is all about. Can you pass the salt? Yes, right? The communicative intent there is contextually informed, and it's about a request to do something, not about simple yes or no answer. And then, of course, in green here, we have whoever's trying to interpret the information. Right? Now, I had a slide that I think I took out that had somebody saying, wait, I didn't realize this was a linguistics talk. No, it's not a linguistics talk. Because the problem is that none of that stuff ever worked for real, right? We have all of these different things that people have tried. So here's the key idea that I'm trying to introduce in this talk. What if we could represent the underlying stuff as language itself? We spent years, decades, trying to write parsers and semantic parsers and sentiment analyzers and emotion labelers and rhetorical structure theory parsers and discourse representation theory, things that would construct it. And none of that stuff actually ended up working. We tried, and a part of that is you can't even figure out what the right representation is. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to actually build a little grammar of some subset of English, right? You say, okay, a sentence is made up of a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and then a noun phrase is determined, or maybe some adjectives and a noun and so forth. Now, do that for a bit, and now go off to the front page of any newspaper you like, take the grammar you wrote, and any sentence that you get there, and tell me if you can actually parse the sentence using that grammar. Coming up with the right representations is super hard. So the idea here is to use language as the representation for the underlying stuff, right? Now, there's some hope that one could do this. I did this yesterday, right? I went to ChatGPT 4.0, And I said, here are two possible statements by the wife in a couples therapy session, blah, 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 that scenario. And I said, what would you infer about the couple's relationships given the two different statements? And its answers were not terrible, right? Now, there's a whole conversation to have about why it does that. And I will simply do a little self-plug here for a paper that is currently up on arXiv that I've written called Large Language Models Are Biased Because They Are Large Language Models. And one of the things it talks about is the way that large language models are essentially internally representing the structure of the world as reflected through the language that it's trained on, using a prediction objective. In order to predict well, it has to capture a lot of structure. Well, this thing has captured a lot of structure. Apparently, it gets the difference between the causative, the dishwasher broke yesterday, the inchoative, the dishwasher broke yesterday, and the causative, he broke the dishwasher, including the implications, right? That there was a causation involved. Wow, that's just the kind of stuff that we tried to capture with all of these representations and parsers and so forth. Is there a question? If people want to interrupt, it's okay. So first of all, I'm not making any claims about its responses being good. I'm only in this slide commenting on intuitively there seems to be some information there. And let's talk about what we actually do in order to look at see whether things are good or not. Right? So this is not the application per se of the idea. It's just an intuition builder, if you will. I think that's the intent. Okay, so here's another example that's a little closer to social science, right? So somebody tweets, build the wall. What's going on? I mean, that's 3 words. That does not give your whatever analysis you're doing in the Grimmer and Stewart pantheon of analysis methods a whole lot to work with, right? On the other hand, it is plausible to infer that if somebody, especially somebody who is identified as MAGA Patriot 83, said build the wall, that some of their underlying attitudes, which I have to emphasize I am presenting in a value-free way, right, are that they believe a wall should be built on the US-Mexico border, that illegal immigration should be limited, et cetera, right? So the question now becomes, can we get those underlying representations in language from the overt language? That's the first step, yes. Mm-hmm. That's right. So one of the things you're emphasizing there is the importance of context. This is one of the places where LLMs are, and by the way, I'm not, as you may have figured out from stuff I said earlier, not a huge LLM proponent or fan. I'm a big fan of figuring out good uses for them, for things that they can do well. So this is a good example where, years ago, Ray Mooney said, as this stuff was getting popular, you can't get the entire semantics of a bleeping sentence, he didn't say bleep, into a bleeping vector. Turns out he was wrong, right? You can actually use the sentential context. So if I said I'm doing some gardening, I need to stop the water from getting there, I'm going to build the wall tomorrow, right? Something large language models are actually surprisingly good at is a contextual interpretation, coming up with some contextual representation, which I think is getting at the issue you were asking about. Okay, so if we can do this, then what does it open up if we can do it reasonably well? What it means is that implicit content behind language becomes a first-class citizen along with the overt language, and therefore available to everything else we want to do with language using all of the methods we use with language, whether those things exist today or whether we come up with them 5 years from now or 10 years from now, right? So if we can do this, it really changes things because it makes implicit content something that has the same status as explicit content, the stuff inside the little brain bubble, which we're interested in, is now actually available to us to work with. It gives us a different lens on things, right? So I'm going to now talk about two pieces of work and then zoom back out at the end. One is the paper that was, I think, linked to in the seminar announcement here, work done with Alexander Hoyle and Rupak Sarkar, Pranav Goel. And this is the core of the paradigm in a nutshell, the core. How do you get this implicit stuff to be explicit? This is hard, actually, to get right? So this gets back to your question a moment ago, where you don't want to just like, oh, well, let's just ask the language model, right? So what we did was develop sort of a protocol or a paradigm, if you will. Think of this more as a framework than as a specific technique, right? And this 1 through 5 here is the essence of it. So you come to the table with a data set and some research questions, just like we always do, right? For that data set, sample your text items. I use the word documents like we always do to represent anything from a tweet to a presidential address. And then manually craft exemplars for those randomly selected examples. Exemplars that show the kinds of implicit and sometimes explicit also propositions that you would like. So the build the wall, Donald Trump should be president, might be an example where you generated that as an exemplar of the kind of thing you're looking for, right? Then prompt the large language model with some variation on something that's going to look a lot like this prompt on the right-hand side. Alexander and I had a very, very intense conversation where he emphasized very strongly and loudly, a prompt is not a method. Right? Let's please remember this. Right? I mean, it's like, wow, chain of thought. Let's think step by step. Anyway, I told you about my attitudes towards LLMs and what else going on. We can talk about the research. So prompt a large language model with something like this, which might make specific reference to your research question or to the data set or both. Right? This is not intended to be just plug this specific thing in. Use the exemplars that you generated, and then this is important. We call these things that are spit out as language, we call them inferential decompositions. Why? Well, they are in inferences from what was said, so they are therefore inferential. And they are decompositions in the sense that we talk about semantic decomposition as being, here is the semantic content decomposed into various pieces. So it's a very loose analogy. It's not really related to compositional semantics in any sense, but the term gives the flavor of what we're trying to do. So we call these inferential compositions or decompositions, inferred propositions, sometimes we'll say, and validate, right? Make sure that the thing is generating things that are plausible as the implicit content for the explicit content that you gave it. If it's not doing that well, garbage in, garbage out for everything downstream. And once you've done that validation, now you can use the implicit along with the explicit in your target task. And that's the idea. Okay, so here's an example, a real example. So on the left, I roamed and rambled and followed my footsteps, blah, blah, blah. Happy National Park Week. Let's get out from behind our screens and enjoy this beautiful land we call home. On the right-hand side, federal lands and waters must not be opened up to fossil fuel extraction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you do a standard clustering of any kind, including with the usual embeddings, right, these things are not close to each other. If you do the inferential decompositions, right, and we have some different ones below, so in the blue and in the orange, right? National Park Week is a time to appreciate natural wonders. Federal lands and waters should be protected from fossil fuel extraction. That's closer, right? You go down to the other, these are really actual generation. Exploring nature is beneficial. Preserving natural resources for future generations is important. Now you start to see what's happening here. You're getting this many to one flavored mapping into a semantic space, right? You have one thing, but there are lots of other aspects of these things that may actually be closer to each other in a semantic space, the underlying proposition, right? Now, it's very important to validate this stuff. In that particular paper, which has all the details, the basic idea is you give human beings the question, if somebody said text 1, is it reasonable to conclude, is it plausible that they would also say text 2? Right? So if I ask this room, if somebody said build the wall, exclamation point, is it reasonable that they would also say Donald Trump should be president? And you do this on a Likert scale, 1 to 5, and it turns out that 85, depending on the details, 85 to 93% of those are rated a 4 or 5 on that 5-point Likert scale of validation. So here's one application of this stuff. We were working with the Food and Drug Administration looking at public comments to the decision process to authorize or do emergency authorization for a COVID vaccine for children. Government agencies are required to get public comments. They're officially required to look at the public comments and take them into account. In this case, that might have been hard. There were 130,000 comments, right? The work I'm talking about here is just on a random sample of 10,000 of them, right? So you have one of these. Please stop the vaccination of children. You know it's wrong, blah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Stop the madness now. So when you generate these inferential decompositions, right? COVID vaccines are poison. The COVID vaccine is more dangerous than COVID. Vaccinating children is immoral, right? So we're getting these sort of pithy, proposition-sized chunks, these decompositions. And then, for example, we can embed them using it's language. We can use the whole arsenal of things you do with language, for example, creating sentence embeddings. And then we can say, cluster those embeddings. So if you want to do some sense making, understanding what's in this very large set of things, there are a couple of different things we could do. We could just cluster the original comments, or hey, wait, these things are shorter. Maybe it's length that matters. So we could do sentence breaking and cluster sentence-sized things, or we could go ahead and do clustering of these decompositions. And this is a visual, but it conveys a good sense, cherry-picked visual, but still visual, of what actually you see coming out of this. So children are low risk is a way of labeling. We didn't automatically label these things, but if you look at for example, the things that are at or near the centroid of the cluster, they're good representatives of the cluster, right? And so you can see that these things that are children are low risk, which is one of the arguments that people were making to the FDA, why they shouldn't authorize an emergency COVID vaccine for children, you can see that it's much tighter in the decomposition space than in the original comment space. You can make a lot more sense of it in that sense, right? And in fact, if you do the usual kinds of measurement of clusters, it's better, right? In addition, if you have human beings reading and evaluating, doing stuff with these clusters, right? Well, these things are shorter, right? They're shorter, they're pithy. So it takes a lot less time. And if you give people a task that says, here's a set of things from this cluster, here are 2 things, which one goes with them, those 4 things more, right? It's kind of a membership-y evaluation, separate from the automated evaluation. You also do better, right? Another application of this stuff. Ringe et al., for example, developed models. Now, shifting gears a little bit, think about the Congress and like ideal points and all sorts of stuff that's focused on voting. An interesting question in political science is, why do certain people vote the same way? The standard approaches to this say, well, we're going to look at variables like their demographics. Are they, male-male versus male-female? We're going to look at what state they're in, right? Are they in the same state or not? Or are they geographically similar, et cetera, right? Are they in the same party or not? The center of the method introduced by Ringe et al. Was essentially this lambda thing here, right? You're looking at what we call co-voting. To what extent are they voting the same way as a proportion of all the voting that takes place for 2 people, I and J, in the Congress, right? And what they did was essentially use something like a similarity matrix, demographics, right? Are they matched in gender or not, or your states? Right? You can essentially measure similarity in lots of different ways. In some preliminary work in Pranav Gault's dissertation, this is in his thesis too, we measured, we basically added text similarity of the legislators' tweets and discovered that that helped over and above these demographic things. What we did here was do the same thing by adding the implicit stuff behind the legislators' tweets via this inferential decompositions method, right? So, you know, the Supreme Court should be saved from threats to reproductive rights. Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation could jeopardize reproductive rights, et cetera, et cetera. The main point of this slide, I won't go into the details of the stars and the dots and the stuff, and read the paper, is that the decompositions give you a similar, you know, we're getting a good flavor of people being closer versus further. And as a quantitative result, we have just using the text similarity of the tweets versus these decompositions, and you know, results table, results table, results table. Higher is better for one thing, and lower is better for the other. R is the thing that's using the decompositions, and it's better. Right? So another, a little bit more than a case study, but another use case illustration for a place where adding the implicit stuff gets you results over and above the implicit stuff. Now, more recently, and this is not in the paper that was posted, this is a paper that's currently under review. There's a question in the back.
One of the reasons the decomposition works is because LLMs can code all that information.
Right. You mean instead of the Ringe et al. Model, just have LLMs do something? Just ask it to come up with a number for text similarity. Yeah, so there's a reason that we're not doing that. We are making what we think of as a principled separation between LLMs as a text analysis or language processing tool versus as a social science model of the kind we want. We really don't believe you should throw away ideal point models because you have, say, an LLM that can take some stuff and spit out a number with a black box, because we have no idea how that model works, right? So from a social science perspective, this goes back to the comment, the somewhat snarky comment that I made a little bit earlier, right? Let's just use LLMs, right, for everything. The problem with that is twofold. One is the black boxness of it, right, which social scientists really don't like. And I also do work in mental health, and I can tell you that you know, clinicians really don't like black boxes. And you know, here's a score, right? And even if you validated it, like, hey, look, it's pretty well correlated, right? Even if you bother to do that, with a lot of people don't, right? You still have the problem of, well, all of the usual problems that you have here. The second reason is that we believe social science models actually have value as models. A lot of thought has gone into the issues behind them. So what you're saying could be done. One could try it. Our code's up on GitHub. You can try some of this stuff and see how it works. But I am not replacing social science modeling, or NLP even for that matter, with LLMs all the way down. Good question.
Maybe, so when you accept the implicit versus explicit part is important in the prompt. And so
yeah. Yes. There was a certain amount of prompt engineering that went in there, which is, and in the paper in an appendix, and certainly in Alexander Hoyle's dissertation, there's more detail about the actual prompts. This is one of the reasons why I characterize this as, in some sense, a framework rather than a method per se. Again, a prompt is not a method, right? So is it possible there are other ways of framing the prompt that might help? Possibly. We, in fact, did have a comparison that said, here's a prompt that says, focus only on implicit information, versus one that said, implicit and explicit information. And the latter worked better, for example. That said, I do want to, again, make a little bit of a standing on a soapbox point. Trying different prompts like that if they are not guided by some underlying constructs or theory, is, and I have now been debating which word to use, maybe you guys can vote, I either complete that sentence with alchemy or with cooking, right? You like alchemy better? Yeah. Pre-scientific chemistry involved trying a bunch of stuff, being recorded, I just edited myself, and seeing what worked better. I'm not saying there is no value in doing such things. Useful things can come out of that, right? As I pointed out in an earlier conversation, we've known that willow bark tea, right, helps reduce pain for a really long time, right? People synthesized, starting in the late 1800s, the same stuff, but we didn't actually know how it worked until the early 1970s. So I'm not saying that trying different things and seeing what works, I mean, hell, I'm married to a clinical psychologist. I can tell you that if you're going to a psychologist for depression, anxiety, or whatever, or to a psychiatrist, they're going to try you out on a drug. They're going to see how you react. They're going to increase or decrease or switch you. That's there's an element that is not science. In the same way that alchemy is not science, but has value in the same way that alchemy had value. Yes.
So, quick follow-up. So I wasn't necessarily thinking that maybe other prompts that would work better. I'm just
Mhm.
trying to think about. I think if I understand correctly, your assumption that it's working well because it's getting at this implicit information.
Right.
So I'm just thinking, like, is it that, or is it simply an LLM thing that even if you ask it to something that had nothing to do with implicit information, it would actually work well as well? So was this test to kind of test this assumption that it has to be there?
So one possibility, for example, would be to ask it to generate paraphrases, right? And then do a comparison. We did, in fact, do some stuff like that. I don't think I have a formal result that I can point you to, but we can follow up afterwards because Alexander might. We did care about the question of whether bringing to the surface things that were not there in the text was actually adding value, right? But you're right, and to the point of, that you made, if you ask something for a summary, the LLM is also applying all of its knowledge, right, to this, and it's going into the summary. That might be another way of saying, well, look, what you're doing is implicitly taking advantage of this implicit content, right? That could make perfect sense. What we did here as a first step to try to do these things was to say, let's be really crisp about it, right? Let's try to define what we mean by implicit content, both for human beings and in the prompt. And then let's actually try to explicitly generate that so that we can do the turning the dials and pulling the levers to try to evaluate the impact of it. Yes. We have explicit and implicit, yes. That what you're seeing in some of these examples here, I believe was from the prompt that actually allowed both. So that's a super question. I think we're also, again, going to have to go back to the paper at Alexander's dissertation to look at that. You can know for sure there is implicit. I mean, the build wall example there is a real example. So you definitely know that it is proposing things some of the time. I think your question is, well, how much of the time, how much work is that doing? I think that might have been done in some of the early stuff that we were exploring, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but please follow up on that. So I think it's a really good question. Yes. Well, we actually did do something like that. And in fact, the exemplar generation step is exactly that, right? So we had the researchers themselves generating exemplars. I can't remember if we asked average people to do it, right? But that is exactly what we were doing. The exemplars are human-generated inferential decompositions. That's exactly the point. Yeah. And like many things, maybe you could do it better if you had a little army of people doing it. And then we try to use the LLM to reduce the need for a little army of it. So going back to this community level attitudes thing, which was sort of a new step in this stuff. The question has to do with, if you look at a community and its attitudes toward a certain issue, right? What can you learn about it? The obvious thing to do here is stance detection, right? You say, what's their, here's a collection of, the R conservatives subreddit, for example. We've also done stuff with our Democrats, just to be clear, we're not focusing on one versus the other. And the idea there would be, well, let's just do stance detection, pro, anti, and neutral. Now, this is the kind of thing that you might have, as you see in this example on the screen. However, look at our conservative, right? Everybody's against abortion, or at a minimum, not for it. Doing that labeling doesn't tell you a whole lot, right? It doesn't allow you to get at the nuances, right? It's like trying to do chess rankings, right? And saying good at chess or not, right? So can we get something that's more fine-grained? And the idea here, right? I'm going to skip that, is to use these decompositions for that purpose. So you can look in the space of the original comments, right? But you can also do this inferential decomposition generation thing in just the same way as we had done previously, ceteris paribus, with a different, modifying the prompt for the specific research question and what we're asking the thing to do, right? Thank you. So we did that. We validated. In this case, it wasn't 90-ish%. It was more like 80-ish% that these decompositions were, in fact, plausible things to infer. And then here's something super interesting. I mentioned chess for a reason. If you know how chess rankings work, there is an algorithm where you take all the pairwise players, right? And you take this set of outcomes and you throw them into this optimization algorithm, and outcomes, putting them on a continuous scale. Incidentally, this is also what there is happening in RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback. One of the main techniques they do is they have a whole little army of people who are underpaid, located in Kenya, suing because they were mistreated, who sit all day and look and say, is this more hate speechy than that? Or is this more violent than that? Whatever the labeling thing happens to be. And then that gives a score, which is what goes into the reinforcement learning reward calculation, right? Okay, so it's very similar. We do pairwise, either for, you can do this for original comments, or you can do this for these attitudes, right? I'm sorry, so Rupak called them attitudes. I just want to call them inferential decompositions. These are essentially the inferred stuff, which often relate to attitudes. So a lot of borrowed slides here from Alexander and Rupak and Pranav. And then this scaling, this Bradley-Terry 1952, allows you to put these things onto a continuum. And so now, instead of what stance detection would give you, which is lots of stuff is against, you can actually distinguish the fact that describing government-sanctioned murder in your comment, right, and safe, legal, and rare was a myth, both of which are anti-abortion, are not the same, right, in terms of extremity. And I'm going to, just because I'm short on time, I want to say we also validated this with human pairwise comparisons. So not just the inferential decompositions, but with human pairwise comparisons. And then now that you've got this, and I apologize, we got started late, had the technical problems, there's a bunch of things you can do with it, right? You can now look at the median for this community over time. And one of the things that you will find is stuff that was considered extreme 10 or 15 years ago is now close to the median of the community in terms of what it's expressing now in the R conservative subreddit, as an example. Another thing that we haven't really done a lot of, but is very cool, you can think of this as a way of doing a survey retroactively. As long as people are talking about the issue, you can ask a question that you didn't ask them at the time, right? Even if nobody had done a survey of this community and said, how do you feel about abortion? As long as they're expressing about abortion, we can use this inferential decompositions and comparison method to basically retroactively go back and say, what are their views or attitudes on a scale for these things, right? And so that's something that we're actually pretty excited about. And in the paper, we've done some work looking at questions from earlier, like Pew Research studies, for example. Okay, so because I'm short on time, right, I'm going to skip this stuff. Well, I want to mention another application of this very briefly. Another thing you can do with these decompositions is find pieces of comments that are higher or lower on the scale, which means you can take somebody who is anti-whatever, and sometimes they will say something that could provide an opening for dialogue, right? You see instances like, well, I know we need to save, to keep elderly people from getting COVID because they're high risk, but children are not a problem. Somewhere in there they've said, wait a second, a vaccine could have some value, right? If you can find that and discover that that is on the scale, even you get this, they're overall against, but there's something they said that's higher on the scale, that's a great opening for a conversation, right? The people who have nothing to say that provide an opening are probably not reachable. But the idea of being able to decompose these things and look for places that might be an opening for conversation, for that person, I might say, yeah, but what about when kids visit their grandparents? Right? Protecting kids is protecting elderly people, right? Okay, here's the very last thing I want to end with, and this is and now for something completely different. And I'm doing this largely because I promised David that I would try to fit it in. So the standard view, right, in, believe it or not, I'm talking about like computational neuroscience now, right, and cognitive science. The standard view, right, is we process things bottom up, right? We generate our interpretations from, well, here it's oriented top down, but you have agenda setting, what gets talked about, you have framing, how it gets talked about, we're getting at some of this stuff, and then you have interpretation, right? So here's the intended, the guy driving the car, right? If we are expressing it as he plowed his car into, right? We interpret that as intend is one of the components of meaning, right? What did we get as input? How do we decide what the components of meaning are? However, that is actually, there's good evidence that's actually not how a lot of the stuff that we do when we think actually happens. And here's an example. Okay, so I got this off the web a number of years ago, okay? See what you got here? Oh, wait, whoops, wrong direction. Ruined the setup, here you go, right? Okay. Daddy, why is his body so small? And now you can't unsee it. Okay, I promise you, you cannot unsee it. From now, I have ruined KFC for you forever, right? This is what you are going to think of when you see this. What is the message here? Our perceptions, our bottom-up perceptions are not purely bottom-up. They are influenced by our top-down predictions. Now, what does that mean? It means that our internal beliefs and attitudes, right, influence what we take away. They are the lens of the things, right, that we get when we look at or say analyze stuff bottom up, right? And this is super important. And this is if you read the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, who works on emotion, right? She has a wonderful article called "When a Gun Is Not a Gun," and it talks about shootings that take place when police officers, well, you have some kid who takes a cell phone out and the officer shoots. Her argument, and I think there's a lot of good evidence for it, is he saw a gun. I don't mean he saw a phone and decided it was a gun. I mean, he saw a gun. If you define perception using a framework called predictive coding, which is very actively researched in neuroscience right now, you take your expectations, you compare them to the input, and then it's the error signal that gets propagated. So if you are expecting a gun because it's late at night, you've had 3 cups of coffee because it's near the end of your shift, maybe you have racial attitudes that have to do with the person and the neighborhood that you're in, and you make a top-down prediction about what's likely to be coming out of a kid's jacket, right? Then the bottom-up evidence of a black cell phone in the dark may in fact not send very much error signal. That's her argument, right? And so her argument is we need to focus on what goes into those top-down perceptions, right? I believe there is a real connection between this predictive coding kind of framework and what we are doing when we are looking at stuff in the social sciences, right? I created these slides giving a talk at Fever, fact extraction and verification, right? And my point was, fact extraction shouldn't be your focus, or it shouldn't be your entire focus, because what we are interested in is not just knowledge as if it exists in the world. What we are interested in is beliefs, which are the things that people have in their heads that are related to but not coextensive with factual knowledge in the world. Therefore, that silhouette with the brain inside and the little blue clouds inside, right, should be an object of study for us. And hopefully the techniques that I have presented today will help us move further in that direction.